Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. I need my drugs, my Nurofen, my painkillers, including whatever the fuck that is. But I need these for the tooth because basically it has been causing me no end of trouble. The clove oil is starting to have little effect now, so I'm going to have to be more creative in trying to avoid the pain, quite frankly. But of course, that's not what you called. You came for the book, and I will read from the book. So, let's get this show on the road, shall we? So, let me actually lift my chair up a little bit. Where's the thing? There we go. I actually feel a bit better now. So, yeah, we'll start from here. In this way, page 61, by the way, of farm-like animals. In this way, the most stupid herd-like of the farmed animals are used to reinforce the ideological narratives of the managerial elite. Even when the new narrative, being unthinkingly bleated, goes against what are supposedly the foundational principles of society, the simplest, most fundamental political or moral principle can be inverted by the elite. Murder is always wrong, but it's a mother's right to stroke number one. I'm off to a good start. To murder her unborn baby. In liberal democracies such as Germany, there has been talk for some time of banning the second most popular party in the democracy in order to protect democracy. Germany is wrestling with a potentially explosive debate over whether to ban the supposed far-right party. Alternative for Germany, or AFG. Black lives matter, but it's racist to say white lives matter. Journalists, the propagandists of the managerial elite across the West, the squealers, simply bleat such ideological reversals over and over, in the belief that the masses are so stupid that we will simply repeat it. No one has learned anything from Animal Farm. Orwell ends his fairy story with these words. Years passed, the short animal lives fled by. A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion. She, Clover, was 2 years past the retiring age, but in fact, no animal had ever actually retired. In Britain, the need to fund the state pension has been used for decades as an excuse for mass immigration. Then the retirement age was increased. The state pension, in which taxpayers must compulsorily contribute, was renamed as a state benefit. And in 2024, the discussion has turned to means testing entitlement to this benefit. The tax-free threshold was frozen, so anyone with any kind of private pension will end up paying more tax in retirement, and even the bare minimum state pension will soon will soon be higher than the tax-free threshold, so will technically be liable for tax. And yet still millions of immigrants arrive every year or two for decades. For decades, the elite simply spent the money the public were being forced to pay into their pensions. Yet British politicians, the elite despised and demonized, were pointing out in the 1950s and 1960s that the state pension was not properly funded. This unfunded benefit was the part of the lure of the welfare state offered by the socialists of all parties after World War I and World War II, just as it was a lure offered to those who lived on Animal Farm. Those with the power are the managerial elite, who control what is remembered and what is perceived. They will pretend they do this to provide for your welfare, but really that is just one of the ways they distract you from the managerial elite's ever-increasing acquisition of power and riches. As Orwell was to point out in 1984, he who controls the past controls the future. So in what follows, we must excavate various parts of that past, which the managerial elite and the propagandists want you to continue not perceiving or remembering. Oh, and we've got some notes for that. Okay, so we're moving on to page 67 now. Chapter 3. Democracy or oligarchy? This is a quote from Giorgio Meloni. There are those who argue that citizens are not wise enough to take certain decisions, and that oligarchy is the only acceptable form of democracy. But I disagree. End quote. That was the Prime Minister of Italy, 2024. If you already believe that you do not live in a democracy, that a small elite rules over us, and all the talk of democracy and freedom of speech is just a distraction, you can skip this chapter. If you are unfamiliar with the word oligarchy, or you think that Mussolini and Hitler were far right, then you might want to read this chapter. If you don't know that prominent British and American socialists in the 20th century were promoting population control and genocide, you might want to read this chapter. If you have no idea how the elite have controlled books, newspapers, television, and the internet, then you really should read this chapter. We need to talk about those with power, the managerial elite, the ruling pigs of Animal Farm. In the free press of the liberal democratics West, the only times we hear about the oligarchs is when the journalists and politicians talk about Russia. We need to talk about those with... UK should seize oligarchs' assets to pay for reconstruction of Ukraine. 17th of June 2023 from The Guardian. Next point, meet the oligarchs, the Russian billionaires whose jets, yachts and mansions are now in the crosshairs. 4th of March 2022. Again, The Guardian. France gives highest honour to oligarch investigated for prostitution. 21st of March 2011, The Telegraph. And the last point, 2.5 billion loans said to have been given to a Russian oligarch by a British bank and then written off. 19th of January 2009. Again, The Telegraph. Yet Rishi, the slippery Sunak, former Prime Minister of the UK, married into a billionaire family, isn't an oligarch. The Prime Minister's billionaire-in-laws have promoted the values of living a simple life, says the propaganda state-promoted news. State propaganda BBC news media, who claim they're holding power to account. Billionaire George Soros isn't an oligarch. He is a philanthropist. Even if he has spent 32 million interfering in the politics of dozens of different countries. The voice of God, trust the science. Dr. Anthony Fauci made 5 million during the COVID pandemic. Scamdemic. In addition to his annual salary of $450 million. But he's not an oligarch. He's just a lowly government employee. Klaus Schwab isn't an oligarch. He was a mere professor before becoming CEO of the World Economic Forum, the WEF, where he receives a salary of more than $1 million. Meanwhile, his WEF was telling people, you will own nothing and you'll be happy. Rishi the slippery Sunak became a member of Parliament, or maybe I was right first time, when just 63% of the votes cast in his constituency were for him. But don't think that means that most of the people in his constituency voted for him. Around 30% of the people in that area did not vote. Turnout was 69.9%. Nice. Anyway, so he became their MP after only 44% of the people in that area voted for him. In reality, it's even fewer, as so many people have given up on this corrupt system and they no longer bother to even put themselves on the electoral register. If Sunak represents anyone, he represents a small minority of adults who live in that area. And Sunak became Prime Minister when a mere 197 MPs elected him as leader of their party. The members of this Democratic Party had no say. This is what passes for democracy in Britain. In 2019, Sunak's party became the government based on the votes of a minority of voters, see Appendix 8. He's a member of Parliament based on the action of a minority of voters, and fewer than 200 people decided he would be Prime Minister. But he's not an oligarch. He was supposedly the democratically elected leader of the UK when only a tiny percentage of Brits ever had any hand in his progression through different stages of his stages of his success. And I've lost where the fuck I am. Before being selected as the Conservative Party candidate of Richmond in Yorkshire, the safest Conservative seat in the country. The Conservative voters there could be counted on to vote for a donkey, provided the donkey wore the colours of the party. Before being handed that guaranteed place in Parliament, Sunak was head of the new Black and Minority Ethnic Research Unit at Policy Exchange. He was hoisted into power by the elite, but no, he is not an oligarch. Sunak attended private schools in England, then went on to study philosophy, politics and economics, PPE, at Oxford University, the hallmarks of membership of the elite class. Lord William Hague had been the MP who Sunak replaced, and Hague also studied PPE at Oxford. But the West's oligarchs are never named as such. Oligarch is a word they use to designate their enemies. They want us to pay attention to the ear of the elephant while ignoring the legs of the elephant. Later they might want us to disregard the ear and pay attention to only its tail. Policy Exchange claims to be the most influential think tank in Britain, yet refuses to disclose the sources of its funding. In 2020, this clandestine organisation awarded prizes for work in support of the international rules-based order, which turns out to be code for the elite in the West can do whatever they want, make up the rules as they go along, and then order people to follow the rules. Pretty much as we saw with Animal Farm under this rules-based order. Britain's kept Julian Assange in a high-security prison for 5 years before he exposed the covert operations and even criminal behaviour of the global elite. The West arms and funds National Socialists in Ukraine. See Chapter 4.7 below. The human rights organisations, in air quotes, kept silent while the US-funded regime in Ukraine spent 8 years killing Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Ukraine. And NATO blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, bringing cheap gas from Russia to Germany, condemning Europeans to buying expensive American liquefied natural gas, or LNG, all the while condemning Russia for not following the rules-based order. Sunak's ex-employer was not only the elitist institution, not the only elitist institution promoting the myth of the rules-based order. The creation and use of this principle provides a simple lesson in how the elites work. If you search the website of the Washington Post for the phrase rules-based order, the phrase is never to be found before Hillary Clinton's 2014 review of Henry Kissinger's book World Order. The phrase first appears in the Telegraph in September 2015. It doesn't turn up in The Guardian before 2016. Here's the chronology of this supposedly ancient principle across The Guardian from 2015 to 2024. In 2015, there were 0 articles that used the phrase rules-based order. 2016, 2 articles. 2017, 3 articles. 2018, 12 articles. 2019, 14 articles. 2020, 12 articles. 2021, 19 articles. 2022, 46 articles. 2023, 69 articles. Nice. Anyway, 2024, 53 articles in the first 5 months. You can see how they invent a concept and then spread the use of it until it is commonplace. It's likely that from TV news and programs about politics, the public hear the phrase many times a week and increasingly often over the years. Thus, the managerial elite create another groove in what George Orwell describes as the gramophone mind. In case you are too young to know what a gramophone is, it's the device that plays vinyl recordings of music. This principle, the rules-based order, which they came to use systematically to condemn Russia after the first 3 months of 2022, was a principle they were inventing and spreading from 2014, the very year they were organising the National Socialist coup in Ukraine. See Chapter 4.7 below. These are the ways that your perceptions of reality are incrementally shaped by the elite. Just as happened with the farmed animals of Orwell's book, the elite pigs gradually manipulating their control of the other animals. The elite invents and then spreads these principles to justify their actions in holding on to power and riches, to make their manipulation of the world seem like they are not directing events. They tell the public that Russia is breaching the international rules-based order, but don't say that this is a principle they invented just a few years earlier. There's no declaration about the rules-based order, which all the countries signed, but the principle is invented to justify the actions of the West. We realise that this may seem extraordinary, so the rest of the book shows how they do it. Moreover, many people have explained the ruling elite tricks in the past century or so. Orwell is just the most famous of these writers, and Animal Farm is the simplest account of how it works. Those with the real power do not want you to understand how power works, because in doing so, you will understand how they control you. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The rule-based order is merely a high-sounding justification for the shifting, totally unprincipled actions of liberal democracies. Often, their high-sounding schemes are the very opposite of what they claim, such as the UK Equality Act, which legalises discrimination in favour of a whole set of political mascots. This unprincipled scheming might sound Machiavellian to those who know anything about politics, along with Orwell's 1984. The UK government also now classifies BBC TV shows such as Yes Minister and The Thick of It as signs of far-right extremism. The Oxford English Dictionary defines Machiavellian as a person who practices expediency in preference to morality, an intriguer or schemer. We saw in Animal Farm how the pig managerial elite were prepared to abandon any principle to attain more power and wealth for themselves. Of course, for centuries, every would-be politician has studied the writings of Machiavelli. His most famous book, The Prince, is no longer than Animal Farm. Orwell started writing Animal Farm at the end of 1943, the same year in which James Burnham's book, The Machiavellians, was published. Burnham's had been a strong supporter of Trotsky. One of the most important parts of Burnham's book is his discussion of how political parties work. That is, a discussion of the work of the Marxist academic Robert Mitchell's. In 1946, Orwell published an analysis of Burnham's views, which begins, and I quote, James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution, 1941, made a considerable stir. When it was published, the book argues, capitalism is disappearing. But socialism is not replacing it. What is now arising is a new kind of planned centralized society which will neither be capitalist nor, in any accepted sense of the words, democratic. The rulers of this new society will be the people who effectively control the means of production, that is, business, executives, technicians, bureaucrats, soldiers, lumped together by Burnham under the name of manager. These people will eliminate the old capitalist class, crushing the working class and so organising society that all power and economic privilege remain in their own hands. Each society will be hierarchical, with stroke number 3, with an aristocracy of talent at the top and a mass of semi-slaves at the bottom. In his published book, The Machiavellians, Burnham elaborates and also modifies his original statement, emphasis added. You can easily recognise how much of Orwell's 1984 in this passage, and much more of the Brave New World and Animal Farm too. In Britain, after World War II, this unity was openly known as consensus politics. From 1945 to 1979, the Thatcher Revolution. Big businesses, civil servants, trade unions, and politicians of all parties worked together to enrich and empower themselves and their corporate bodies, while democracy and individual freedom were marginalised. During this time, the UK has taken into an anti-democratic European Union with no mandate from the people, following decades of deception by the elite, started by one Edward Heath, when he signed us up to that fucking European market. The above review by Orwell demonstrates that at very latest, between writing Animal Farm and 1984, Orwell was studying the work of Burnham. I'm getting a spam call. Fucking hell. Spam callers are trying to get a hold of me. It's probably O2. Anyway, where was I? Orwell thought of this review of his sufficiently important that he not only published it as an anti-communist journal called Polemic, but Orwell also published the review himself as a pamphlet, but many agree that Burnham's views were basically those of German sociologist Robert Mitchell's, or Michael's, or however you pronounce his fucking name. Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong all the time for all I know. Michaels and Burnham were both prominent thinkers whose works have been obscured for many decades. Burnham devised a social theory which has been popularized and criticized until many have forgotten its origins in the Burnham-Trotsky debate on the left. The theory was itself a popularization of the criticism levelled by Marxism by Michaels, a theory of bureaucracy as an alternative source of power, neither capitalist nor socialist, but a phenomenon of modern society. Mitchell's is probably the single most important thinker to expose how any organizations of any significant size all fall under the control of the managerial elite, an oligarchy, a group who then exploit the organization for their own ends. It's hard to believe that anyone could read Michael's book, Political Parties, in 1911, without realizing how astute and relevant is his analysis to everything that's happened since he's wrote it. It could be written today because it still seems to be talking to our situation. Michaels was highly educated and came from a middle-class German family. In Germany, he was a member of the Social Democratic Party. Despite its moderate-sounding name, this was an explicitly Marxist party from 1891 to 1959. And because of his socialist views, it was impossible for Michaels to qualify for a teaching position at a German university. Yet, Michaels did not abandon his Marxist party despite the penalties. At the outbreak of World War I, Michaels refused to support Germany in the war, unlike the Marxist political party of which he was then made a member, which swung behind German nationalism and militarism. Instead, Michaels moved to Switzerland, where he became professor of economics. He moved to Italy and joined the Italian Socialist Party, and in the 1920s he would teach in Rome, later becoming professor of economics in Perugia, Italy. Michaels was sympathetic to Marxism, anarchism, and revolutionary syndicalism. Syndicalism is another name for trade unionism. Peter McLaughlin read the work of Michaels when studying politics at university, yet outside that environment he never again heard Michaels mentioned in the following decades. But one of the people on the same politics course as McLaughlin was someone who went on to be in the cabinet of the UK government, so we can be sure that the political class know what Michaels had to say. Huge numbers of UK politicians and civil servants studied the degree Philosophy, Politics and Economics, the PPE, at Oxford University, where they will have to read Michael and other thinkers who emphasise how elite control democracies. As mentioned above, Sunak and his predecessor, Lord Hague, both studied that degree at Oxford. PPE is the degree of choice for the Westminster elite, and in 2010, claiming 6 cabinet members and 3 Labourship leader contenders among its alumni. Since the people who rule you know these studies how the political power works, it's important for you to know about them, unless you're happy with them treating you like a farmed animal. If you do not understand the landscape on which your enemy is fighting you, then you are at a permanent disadvantage. Michael's analysis effectively predicted why the communist revolution in Russia in October 1917 would end up leading to a dictatorship, or again, maybe I was right first time, by a political elite. Furthermore, his analysis explains why elites take over every organization. We can see that his contemporaries saw how important and insightful was Michael's analysis by looking at the speed of which his 400-page book was translated into other languages. The 1915 English translation is from the Italian edition of 1911. But in that English edition, Michael's comments on stroke number 5, man alive. But in that English edition, Michael's comments on the reviews of the translations of it into German, French, and Japanese. Michael's name is listed alongside those who are more generally recognized as the most important analysts of society and politics. Some academics even go as far as saying that the study of political parties' work has been completely dominated by Michael's analysis. But it is not in the interests of those with political power that the public should know what Michael's exposed and what solutions he recommended, so his work is only read by those at university. What is an oligarchy? A form of government in which power is confined to a few persons. That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. How many people in the UK truly have any political power? Probably at a minimum 50,000 people, but possibly as many as 10 times that number. Certainly not the vast majority of voters in every election. The majority never get the policies of which they voted. Some academics have argued that the entries in Who's Who can serve as a guide to who constitutes the interconnected network of the powerful elite. Who's Who, in 2023, has 33,000 entries and costs over £300 to buy. When do you think you last had any real effect on social or economic policy or the passing of law in the UK? Can you think of a single example where you can say, if I hadn't have been involved, the policy would have been different? You might think, well, as a whole, we, the majority, do control what politicians do. Then consider Appendix 8, which shows the decades of UK elections and just how few voters actually put a government in power. 20% of voters actively chose the 2024 Labour government, which ended up with a huge majority in the Houses of Treachery, Parliament. See the rightmost column of Appendix 8. Since many see that electoral system is a scam, they no longer even put themselves on the electoral register. So it's far fewer than 20% of the adult citizens who chose this socialist government with this huge majority of MPs. Moreover, as we will show later in chapter 3.5, the powerful parties know that they only need to target a subset of voters in marginal seats in order to get power. We'd say we are surprised that academics and journalists don't draw attention to this, but then they are the part of the scam that Britain is a democracy. Our criterion... Come on, no dying on the job. Anyway, our criterion of defining membership of the oligarchy is anyone who has more influence on economic or social policy than the average voter is a member of the oligarchy. Thus, every journalist and presenter of political debate in the media is a member of the oligarchy, although there are others in the oligarchy who have more power than most of the media professionals. We can consider Animal Farm as an illustration of how an oligarchy comes to dominate the majority. Even the example of what was supposedly a revolutionary, egalitarian workers' cooperative. Generally, leftists were horrified by what Michaels showed, decades before Orwell's novel, because Michaels showed that supposedly egalitarian leftists are no different from the aristocracy they supposedly despised. It's not just in Animal Farm that Orwell shows leftists becoming an oligarchical elite. The real villain in Orwell's 1984 is Ingsoc, English socialism, and we will discuss this distinctively English socialism, Fabianism, in chapters 3.3 and 5.4. In 1955, a few years after Orwell's death, R.T. Mackenzie produced a 700-page study of the workings of the Labour and Conservative parties in Britain. In this book, Mackenzie assesses Britain's political parties from the perspective of Michaels, namely that Conservative parties and Socialist parties and the trade unions are really only pretending to have any interest in democracy, their claims to this merely being hand-waving to distract the public from how these organisations really operate. Mackenzie concludes that Michaels' analysis is borne out of the ways in which both Labour and Conservative parties in the UK work. Mackenzie's book... Mackenzie's book, which was reprinted in 1958, with a second edition in 1963, which was again reprinted in 1992, and the book was published in both the USA and the UK by mainstream publishers. Whilst we in the 21st century, with all our leisure time, our access to information, internet, apps, books and e-books, know nothing of the British people between 1955 and 1992, were reading 700-page books that showed just how British democracy, in air quotes, worked. By 2021, the BBC was boasting that 38% of 18-year-olds go to university. In the 1960s, only 4% of school leavers went to university. The population got more educated, but also less informed, which prompts the question, is education really indoctrination? How many graduates now do you know who would be prepared to read a 700-page book on the nature of democracy? Most graduates we have met read nothing more challenging than a detective novel. Bread and circuses, say the elite, as they laughed amongst themselves. Whilst Michaels showed that democracy leads to oligarchy, as a leftist he wanted to avoid accusations of hypocrisy against those who exploit the fundamental problem of representative democracy to get power and enrichment, particularly since his focus was his own Marxist Social Democratic Party. However, we do not shy away from calling things out for what they are. The oligarchy are evil and must be removed from power. Moreover, the problem of control by the oligarchy isn't just confined to how political parties work in representative democracies. The control of every organisation by those at the top is inescapable in any organisation, beyond the very small. This applies to churches, companies, trade unions, charities, etc., etc. This is known as the iron law of oligarchy. Organisation implies the tendency to oligarchy. In every organisation, whether it be a political party, a professional union, or any other association of the kind, the aristocratic tendency manifests itself very clearly. If the current corrupt anti-democratic political parties are replaced by new parties, the same problem of oligarchy will return. Following the publication of Michael's book, this was considered to be very depressing, or a very depressing realization. However, in Chapter 6, we have a solution that offers hope. Direct democracy. In universities, it was not only in the Department of Politics, but also in the area of sociology and organizational management, where Michael's analysis continued to be discussed. Michaels explains the inherent problem with organization leading to stroke number 6, oligarchy. As organization develops, not only do the tasks of the administration become more difficult and more complicated, but further its duties become enlarged and specialized to such a degree that it is no longer possible to take them all in a single glance. According to the letter of the rules, all the acts of the leaders are subject to the ever-vigilant criticism of the rank and file. As the organization increases in size, this control becomes purely fictitious. The members have to give up the idea of themselves conducting or even supervising the whole administration, and are compelled to these tasks over the trustworthy persons specially nominated for the purpose to salaried officials. The conclusion is stark. Voting in elections are just a pretense that those who are voting are in control. If this applies to an avowedly egalitarian pro-democracy organisation, it is almost certainly true that it applies even more so to those organisations which do not have any commitment to democracy and accountability. And it is clear that the leaders know this, but do not want the voters to understand the fraud being perpetrated upon them. What Michaels didn't bring out is that since there are many organisations and each is controlled by an oligarchy, then all of these oligarchies overlap. And thus we should instead refer to the oligarchy because the oligarchy in the media will protect the politicians, and the oligarchy in the business in the world will be protected by the politicians, etc., etc. MPs will serve on the boards of companies, they will marry journalists or aristocracy, they will promote their business owners to positions of power elsewhere, in government agencies, in control of universities, the House of Lords, etc., etc. When the MPs retire, they too will be elevated to powerful positions in business, academia, or the media by their cronies and relatives in the oligarchy. One hand washes the other hand. Michaels did not recognize that there are lawyers of power within an oligarchy. If among the electors any are to be found who possess some influence over the representative of the people, once the elections are over, their number is very small. They are the big guns of the constituency or of the local branch of the party. In other words, they are the persons who, whilst belonging by social position to the class of the ruled, have in fact come to some form of part of ruling oligarchy. Those at the lower layers of the oligarchy don't always know the plans of those higher than them. Who, can we say, is in the oligarchy, no matter if they are at a lower level of this structure or at a higher level? Once again, this is how we define membership of the oligarchy. Anyone who has more influence than the average voter on laws, economy, or social policy is a member of the oligarchy and are terrified of losing their position. Those at the lower level are seeking to rise within the oligarchy and are terrified of losing their position. And becoming as powerless as the vast majority of the voters. As they rise within the oligarchy, they get more wealth and more power. If they fall, they lose wealth and influence. If someone is in the oligarchy but is working to remove the oligarchy power, then that person is absolutely exceptional. The general case would be that the oligarchy... Stroke number 7. The oligarchy would seek to destroy any person who was any kind of threat to it and retaining its extending power. Now, by the looks of it, we move on to chapter 3.1. Trotsky on London's oligarchy. I nearly stumbled again. Before Michaels produced his analysis, there was a novelist who had a very astute understanding of the oligarchy and how it works. In 1937, Trotsky said of this novelist that the storyteller understood better than Lenin the alliance between the upper layers of business and the upper layers of the workers' organizations. The oligarchy ensured that the novelist is not remembered for his political analysis, but instead is only remembered for his books about animal and nature. The novelist's name is Jack London, and the book which Trotsky admired was named The Iron Heel. It seems quite possible that Michael's Iron Law of Oligarchy is a reference to London's novel. You might not know how famous or successful Jack London was in his day, but he had the kind of fame that Stephen King or J.K. Rowling has nowadays. Jack London's novel is set 700 years in the future, where a historian is editing a found text, a diary. So the story consists of the diary and footnotes to the diary made by the historian in the future. The book is concerned with two failed political revolutions. Interestingly, London wrote The Iron Heel just after the failed 1905 revolution in Russia, and the book must have seemed prophetic to Trotsky in 1937, as the novel discusses a future failed revolution, which is precisely how Trotskyists came to view the Bolshevik stroke number 8. View the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia after 1917. Here we have a work of fiction of exceptional political insight, written by pretty much uneducated working-class man, who was able to predict the coming of the 1917 revolution and why it would fail. And all of this in a totally new novelistic format, a format that would seem quite extraordinary today, yet it was written more than a century ago. Experts writing about Orwell's 1984 attribute the idea of a boot stamping on a human face forever as coming from London's The Iron Heel. Moreover, Orwell's concepts of doublethink and newspeak are likely to be institutional versions of what Jack London describes as Thray's slaves. People whose thinking process is immediately terminated or redirected when a particular form of language is used to describe something. Modern versions of this phrase slavery can be seen in Islam is the religion of peace. It's a woman's right to choose. Black people can't be racist. The voters have given us a mandate, etc., etc. Like Trotsky, Orwell held the Iron Heel in high esteem. It's one of the best statements of the outlook that a ruling class must have if it is to survive. That Orwell had read Iron Heel and was writing and broadcasting about it by 1945 explains why experts see the influence of Jack London and the world portrayed in 1984. The vision of how political power works in the Iron Heel is actually of wider interest than many of the more specific mechanisms portrayed by Orwell in 1984. London uses the word oligarch or oligarchy 140 times in his novel, on average, more than once every third page, and about half the time he refers to the oligarchy. From here onwards, we shall refer to the oligarchy as a reminder of London's explanation of how they work. London equates the oligarchy with the Iron Heel, the oligarchy threatening to grind opponents under its heel. The world is ours, we are its lords, and ours it shall remain. The conspiracy that binds the members of the oligarchy together often requires no communication or plotting. They know what to do, they do what is in the interest of the oligarchy. The problem isn't new to the 20th century. London's hybrid novel and political tracts point that shortly before his assassination in 1865, Abraham Lincoln had stated, and I quote, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my own country. Corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavour to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." End quote. London's implication is that President Lincoln was assassinated because of his recognition of the increasing power of the oligarchy in the USA. In the novel, some characters have to learn the hard way that the oligarchy controls the entire political system, the judicial system, the newspapers, etc., etc. Even when those fighting back against the oligarchy get some political power, they are thwarted at every turn. We, the resistance, captured the state legislature of Oregon and put through splendid protective legislation. And it was vetoed by the governor, who was a creature of the trusts, the corporations, the oligarchy. We elected a governor of Colorado, and the legislature refused to permit him to take office. Twice have we passed a national income tax, and each time the Supreme Court smashed it as unconstitutional. The courts are in the hands of the trusts, the corporations. The comparisons with what is going on in the recent years with former President Trump are obvious. While Trump is undoubtedly a member of the oligarchy, he was an influential Democrat long before he took over the Republican Party, it appears that he's going against the oligarchy, the deep state in Trump's word. And for this perceived treachery against them, the oligarchy have used the FBI, the media, the courts against Trump. It's entirely possible that COVID was planned as a means of ensuring the oligarchy controlled the 2020 elections, as Trump's victory in 2016 was apparently not what the oligarchy wanted. And in July 2024, with the attempted assassination of Trump, the negligence and incompetence of the US Secret Service looks highly suspicious. Weeks after the attempted assassination, concrete evidence emerged that local police had told the state professional protection team to cover the building which the assassin used, with the US Secret Service agreeing to do so, but failing to do so. But of course the mainstream media won't tell you this. You know the drill, folks, because say it with me, it doesn't suit the narrative. In the Iron Heel, the oligarchy are able to exploit the power of the Wall Street banks and the government treasury. Even when some of those resisting realize that their salaries as professors can be taken from them by the oligarchy, they think that their private wealth, stocks and shares, mortgaged property owned outright, is safe, but they find out it is also taken from them. Many other professions are not at the upper levels of the oligarchy, but are instead described as mercenaries of the oligarchy. Such mercenaries include the police and the military, the postal service, journalists and teachers. And there are those who would work as agent provocateurs. Doctors are also mercenaries, with them designating people as insane because they refuse to go along with the lies of the oligarchy. He had correct notions of biology and sociology, and because of his incorrect notions, he was doomed to an insane ward. This will presumably be the fate of those who refuse to agree, or we who refuse to agree, that a man with a beard is a woman. As a revolutionary socialist, London could even see how the oligarchy co-opt these trade unions. They can, particularly the larger trade unions. Crimes which do not impede the operations of the oligarchy are allowed to go unpunished, reserving the legal and penal resources to go after those who are attempting to resist the oligarchy's plans. In Britain, over 1 million people were allowed to get mortgages with no checks on their income, with many making fraudulent declarations. The problem was so extensive that the price-stoking leniency was banned in 2011, just a few years after these subprime mortgages caused the 2006-2008 Great Financial Crisis. The oligarchy could then selectively jail those who had used these loopholes, should the person be any challenge to the oligarchy. In this way, crime is encouraged and tolerated, but serves as a trap. Of course, these politicians in Britain who were engaged in mortgage fraud were elevated to the Houses of Lords. The oligarchy permitted Muslim grooming gangs to rape English schoolgirls for 50 years. For their complicity in allowing these crimes to go unopposed, people at the lower level of the oligarchy would be elevated for compliance. The lies the media purvey and the place of censorship play a significant role in the Iron Heel. The media will not allow anything to be said that will go against the oligarchy, which should tell us everything anti-establishment our media says has been agreed by them that in some way is actually useful for the oligarchy, example the lies about the climate change. If the oligarchy could not see the ways to exploit this scam for their enrichment and increased power, the media would remain silent on climate change or even denounce it as a conspiracy theory. Often the media lie and deceive by omission. It's perhaps worth spelling out the way this kind of thing is done. In London's novel, a rebellious bishop addresses a public meeting. telling people to be more Christian and to embrace the destitute. The naive characters think that his speech will create a great debate when it is reported in the news the next day, but one of those wise to the ways of the oligarchy said that not a word of the speech will be reported. Next morning I sent out for all the papers. So far Ernst was right. Not a word that Bishop Morehouse had uttered was in print. Mention was made in one or two papers of the papers that he had been overcome by his feelings, yet the platitude of the speakers that followed him were reported in length. So lies by omission and the rest of the report given to directing the public's attention to aspects of the event that are unimportant, getting the public to focus on other parts of the elephant, but the media are also actively involved in character assassination, destroying those who are a thorn in the side of the oligarchy. Our 24-hour rolling news coverage is infinitely more powerful and speedy in its ability to destroy someone than were the newspapers of Jack London's 1908. But it's worth reading his description of how they did character assassination back in his day. The papers made no mention of the book, but they misreported him beautifully. They twisted his words and phrases away from the context and turned his subdued and controlled remarks into a howling anarchistic speech. It was done artfully. One instance in particular I remember, he had used the phrase social revolution. The reporter merely dropped out social. Sounds like something that anyone could do. Anyway, this was sent out all over the country in the Associated Press dispatch, and from all over the country arose a cry of alarm. Father was branded as a nihilist and an anarchist, and in one cartoon that was copied widely, he was portrayed as waving a red flag at the head of a mob of long-haired, wild-eyed men who bore in their hands torches, knives, and dynamite bombs. He was assailed terribly in the press, in long and abusive editorials, for his anarchy, and hints were made of mental breakdown on his part. In addition to demonization of dissidents, it's obvious that the oligarchy needs to suppress books, and in our day, videos and tweets, etc., etc. And that will be all. I've done a good 47 minutes of that shit. Or more like 46 because of the minute I spent doing drugs. Sorry, Nurofen, disclaimer. But yeah, wasn't expecting to skip that far because I wasn't expecting the manifesto and the notes to come up so quickly. But yes, more information about basically what's been going on. And that brings my grand total of strokes I've had this session to 8. And one day I'll end up seeing the NHS doctor, and as said, he will say to me, stop being a fucking idiot. But until then, I will do this again next Saturday if I'm up to it. Thankfully, my tooth had calmed down for the most part, so I was able to do this shit. But if it continues to stay that way, then we'll read it again from page 79 onwards. So, thanks for tuning in. And remember, keep yourself educated. Because the bottom line is, we have traitors in Parliament and traitors in the oligarchy who will do everything they can to suppress the truth and stop you from understanding how they are trying to control us.